Welcome to the State of the Nation webinar. And I'm very excited today to have somebody that I've known from a previous life. Yes, I did have a previous life. Back in the day, I used to be a stockbroker. And one of the people I worked with was Mr. Kevin Lings, who is now the Chief Economist at Standard Bank.
The Stand-up, yeah, right.
Stand-up.
Yeah.
Kevin, it's so good to have you here.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, welcome to the State of the Nation. For those watching, I'm Michael Sham. We are going to have a little interview, and we've spent a lot of time talking about politics on the State of the Nation. But the State of the Nation generally revolves around two very important things. One being the politics. South Africa is very important, and most of the discussion is dominated by the politics. But it's also about the economics. And in fact, one could argue that the economics is more important because, if the country is not doing well, that's where the problems come. Now, I wrote a strong piece recently. Is there any economic management coming out of government right now?
Mike, unfortunately, it's very little. So you've got documents, right? You've got actually a whole array of policy pronouncements, and I would say that government adds to them on a very regular basis. And at times I can understand that many people, certainly in business, when I've asked people, what do you think of government's policy, they would say, I don't know what the policy is because there's been so many policy documents, right? Going all the way back to the GEAR document, there have been other subsequent documents, and at the moment we've got the Reconstruction and Recovery Program. So if you look at the policy documents, it does try and articulate what the intention is from government. And if you look at that, it's good. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. It talks about the need for growth. It talks about the need for employment. It talks about the need to improve business and to deregulate and get more private-public partnerships going and improve infrastructure. It actually talks about all of those things, and you would be hard-pressed to criticize that document. The problem is that's where it sits. It sits as a document. It gets spoken about in various speeches, but it's not being translated into any sort of action. And so when you're sitting as a business person, what you realize is that nothing's happening, nothing's moving forward. And the key things that the country needs to move forward, particularly things like deregulation, better infrastructure, not just the energy sector, those things are just taking forever. Think about spectrum license. How long have we been talking about the auctioning of spectrum? It feels forever. Everything is just taking so long. And so with that inaction, business loses confidence and has remained as sort of a weak level of confidence now since 2010. Confidence in South Africa at a business level hasn't gone above the so-called 50 index points, which would suggest that business is becoming more optimistic. It's been almost 15 years that we've had these promises, we've had documents, nothing's happened.
And of course, we've had a generation of people that have never known economic growth. It's getting there. Obviously the growth was destroyed with the rise of Jacob Zuma, and here we're sitting all these years later, and one could argue with worse leadership. There's an interesting upside to this one. You mentioned spectrum. To what degree is government inaction? Actually, there's an upside to this. They're so bad at what they do that eventually technology bails them out.
And private sector and social involvement. In other words, if you look at various towns, they take it upon themselves to fix potholes and get involved. And we've seen examples of that. So at some point, the private sector does get involved, and thank goodness. Think about energy provision. Many households in South Africa now have some sort of backup facility, and those that can afford it are trying to put in even more power supply. If you look at many business, we were talking to some farmers recently, and they were saying they've got to go the independent power route because they just can't afford if they just don't have the available power. So you're finding that business is stepping in, societies, communities are stepping in. It's not ideal because obviously you're paying a huge amount in tax for government to make those changes, and they're simply not doing that.
Yeah.
There are also examples where government gets involved and it does simply the wrong thing, and it ends up making the situation worse, right? And so you would then say, well, please, government, stay out of this industry or stay away from this regulation, because by introducing the regulation, you're making it worse. Now, that's not ideal either, because you pay government to actually do a range of things. And in most societies, those services can be very critical. I think in South Africa, we've got a huge government. It's involved in too much. And by being involved in too much, it can't be effective at anything. The advice would be government is get out of the way, reduce the size of government, reduce what you get involved in, try and work out what you are pretty good at and do that, and then try and get the private sector involved in the rest of it. And I think that would give us a much better result. The problem is that is at odds with many of the philosophical approaches that you see within the ANC and within government, and they see government at the center. They talk about a developmental state, the role of government in developing at every level of society and being involved and controlling every level of society. And we find that all the time when we're saying just allow the private sector to do energy, just allow the private sector to do the railway system, get out of the way. When you talk to government, they're not happy with that. They want to be involved because they see that as their role. And so you end up with a philosophical problem where people can't agree on what is the best way forward.
I suppose we must also just remember at this point that the argument of hand it all over to the private sector, it sounds quite inviting. That's not necessarily always the best idea, because sometimes the private sector can be very dishonest brokers.
Oh, for sure.
You know, we've seen that, for example, in our privatized hospitals, which we've all strived to defend. But we are getting charged exorbitant prices for healthcare by international standards, because citizens of South Africa know that there's no option. If you've got some money, you're going to go to a private hospital, much like you're going to go to a private school. And that's not cheap.
That's right. So you've got to find a way of getting the private sector involved in an environment where you look for exploitation. So I'm not suggesting that you step away from this and get private sector involved and simply allow them to price the way they wish to price. And I'm quite in favor of what we proposed to government was, let's look at a real example, a private-public partnership in the provision of water. All right. So what you do is government says to the private sector, you maintain the water supply for this town. You make sure the water treatment is working. You make sure that the facility is delivering clean water. And in return, we will pay you a fee. Not, you can't charge what you want. The hospital is kind of regulated, but there are many loopholes to that. What we're suggesting is government says to the private sector, this is an agreed fee. You can charge this. If you become more efficient at the provision of water, then you can actually claw back a little bit of extra profit, if you like, but you can't charge what you want. And that fee is a reasonable fee by international standards. We think the private sector will get involved in the provision of water. And I think there are solutions to these things. It's not about simply saying, okay, bring private sector in and allow private sector to charge whatever they want. You can bring private sector into a regulated environment, but in such a way that private sector still sees an incentive to be involved.
We've got to remember that probably the best example of the private sector at work, the best parts of the private sector, has probably been in fast food. And I always sort of joke that imagine it's great. You can stop in the middle of nowhere. You can stop in a town with almost no economy and find the fast food chains of your choice. And they'll all be well stocked, good quality, etc., well managed and well priced. And here you are in a town where nothing works.
Sure. Right?
Could you imagine if you had a ministry of fast food? If you had a ministry of fast food, none of that would work, because there'd be regulation, there'd be BE, there'd be heaven knows what. So that I always think is the private sector at its best. But the key there is competition.
Yeah.
Now what you're suggesting is almost the opposite of competition. And we've seen that the private sector starts gouging, right? When the government says, okay, we'll allow you to provide that service on behalf of government, the next thing, the prices start going up, the arguments go up for more, the shortages come in and so on and so forth. They don't behave much better than government.
So take the independent power producers. You've got a very good example of they being given a fee, right? If you are a wind farm owner or a solar plant owner, you can't charge whatever you want. There's certain rules around that. You've got to have a certain amount of your electricity available at any point. You're given a set fee that you can charge, etc. And yet, private sector is more than willing to get involved in that. And each time they've opened that up, we've had another rush of private sector to get into becoming invested in that sector. So I think you can design these systems that, yes, they're not free competition, and in South Africa, some of these things would be exploited, or certain communities wouldn't even get the service because it's felt that they couldn't pay for it, they just couldn't afford it. So I think there's a danger in allowing the private sector to do, in essence, a social service that government should be involved in, but you can craft a partnership. And I see the independent power producers as being in partnership with government to overcome a major obstacle, and there's no doubt in my mind that it's been beneficial. And I think this year you'll see that the energy supply in South Africa improves, in part because you're going to open up more independent power producers.
Yeah.
So I think it's possible. What you need to do is you need to be skillful in how you craft these things, the agreements, in the parameters, that there's something in it for everyone. That this is not just for government and it's not just for the private sector. And because there's so little else happening in this country in terms of investment opportunities, private sector will clamor for that.
They will do. I just think that there's another sort of warning bell. You know, I'm a free marketeer, businessman, entrepreneur. I'm all in for everything, but I'm a little bit afraid, especially when one looks at some of the exploitation that's happened, for example, in the US. Yeah. Around power, around water, where they've had private providers, and it's led down a very, very sad road, even in this country with some of our tenders. But now, Kevin, to me, and obviously we've started off talking about some of the big services, some of the infrastructural needs. But let's talk about the state of the private sector itself, right? Because, you know, it's something I feel incredibly strongly about. South Africa is always, you know, we've sadly been run for the last 70 years by nationalist governments. Nationalist governments like big companies because they can extract rents from those big companies. And the big companies love it because the government puts regulation in place which keeps them dominant, right? You know, one just has to look at the financial sector in this country. The minute they get in, the minute you get a bank that gets to a certain size, you go to the government, you say, we need FICA. And you go and you start a cell phone company and you're there, you want to lock your position in by saying, we want to have RICA. And what happens is the government are so bad at their jobs, they help to keep those monopolies in place. How do we fire up small businesses and entrepreneurs in this country?
So it's clearly the answer for South Africa if you could unlock it, right? And we know that industry, exactly what you say, industry is becoming highly concentrated in almost every single sector. There are one or two where you would say there's decent competition, but particularly if you look at our manufacturing sector, a lot of those industries are represented by two players, three players at best. Highly concentrated, oligopoly type institutions. They've got a lot of pricing power, and they kind of control a lot of the network. They control the distribution, the transport, the procurement. They've got a lot of the big upstream and downstream participants tied into contracts. Very difficult to break the back of that. So I'm not suggesting that you then get involved in even more regulation to sort of regulate away the monopoly. What you've got to do is find a way to make the industry attractive to a wider array of people. Now, that's difficult to do. We know that in other countries, family business makes a big difference. It's not just about anybody being small business starting up. It's about people who are in the business been given the facilities to grow a little bit bigger, to try and employ a few more people, go from medium business to small, go from small business to medium business, maybe to large business. So it's a very long process. It's a very difficult thing to get right, but it certainly is achievable. And in my mind, if I look around South Africa, I see a lot of entrepreneurs trying things. If I look at the guys that are selling stuff on the street corner, if I look at the network of trying to get goods into the city center, set up tables, sell, there's a huge process that's going on, but it just needs to be formalized a little bit more. So I think it's there. What I think is lacking, though, is the institutional ability to fund that and to get that to happen. We tend to either look at the banks, and the banks are not skilled at funding small business. It's never been their primary objective, and they don't do a really good job at that. And then we've got government agencies which are also ineffective at providing the right sort of finance. So in my mind, what you need to do is you need to get a system where you've set up that people are not saying this is profit maximizing. I'm going to fund small business on a profit maximizing. And it's nor is it just I'm going to do this pure development and therefore you've got to meet a whole lot of social conditions in order to get into business. This has got to be set up by people who have been in business, potentially have retired from business, know and understand what small business looks like when they see it, can recognize entrepreneurship and are willing to back that. We are not willing to back our own people. When you go for finance, people want to see all of the security you've got. What property can you put as security? What have you got it as assets? We're not willing to fund that person. But it's not a question of just funding anybody who walks in the door. Is this person really an entrepreneur? And my sense is that you need another entrepreneur to recognize that spark in somebody. So what I'd want to see is a whole lot of people who are retired that understand this, getting involved in this and trying and getting a pool of money together to say, let's start to back our people and get them involved in sectors we think can work. You've got to start somewhere. It's a long process. There's no magic to it. I think we could do a little bit of deregulation, open up markets a bit more. If you take, for example, industry-wide labor agreements. So if you are in the steel industry, right, and you come up with a wage agreement or a set of working conditions for the steel industry, everybody who enters the steel industry, no matter how big or small they are, they have to comply with that industry-wide agreement. And many of the small guys just can't comply because they start up. So maybe you need to have differentiated regulation for startup business, smaller business entering an industry versus existing participants who are already well established and can deal with that onerous regulation. So I think these things can be looked at, existing regulation, existing finance, and the most important thing is just trying to get it out there, get that mindset out there amongst small people, amongst young people to say, get involved. We're going to help you. Try and start something. It's not all about a corporate job, and you can't look at big business for the next job. You've got to take care of yourself. So it's got to do with how we promote it within the country.
Well, I want to challenge you on a few, some of the things that you said over there. Since I started off by saying we worked together, that was a few more years back than not either of us care to admit. But I've been involved since then in any number of businesses and touched a whole lot of other businesses. And I'd like to sort of put it to you that there's some very bad thinking that takes place that's sort of crept into the South African discussion. Number one, this thing about financing small business, I am not a fan of it at all. Okay, and here I'll point to any example you'd care to go to. Any business in the world, right? If somebody says, I want to start a business, I need money, it's not a good business. I've never seen a successful business that was started with a lot of money. I've seen a lot of money get lost when a business gets started with a lot of money. So I'm not a big fan of saying, we've got a way to fund small business, because what all that's going to bring out is going to bring out the shyster, not the entrepreneur. It's going to be the guy who says, well, fine, give me $1 million, I'll start the business, and then he buys a new car, and that says, sorry, the business didn't work out. Right? Most businesses that I've seen succeed when that guy starts the business literally out of his garage,
Sure.
with his
Yeah.
back to the wall, with his mortgaging his property, with him doing whatever it is. So I'm not a big fan of this idea that we need to finance.
But at some point, he's going to need finance, right? Let's say he's a true entrepreneur.
Yes.
He started it in his backyard.
Yeah.
He's got an idea. He's working at it. He's hustling. He's
Yes.
making it. At some point, he's going to need finance. Where does he go?
That's a long way down the road.
Yeah.
And then we're talking about a different thing altogether. And there, I agree with you that then we're not talking about new business funding. You're talking about business funding.
Yeah, so
Right.
I'm not saying take a guy who's just got an idea, right? And he's shown no acumen around that idea, no expertise, no creativity, and you just give him money. I agree with you. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Because 99% of those guys you fund, you're going to fund the wrong guy and you're going to lose your money for a variety of reasons. So you've got to find that guy who is an entrepreneur, who's demonstrated, and you recognize this guy's an entrepreneur. He can show you what he's done. He can show you, but he's got to a point where he's stuck. And he needs economies of scale. He needs the new machine. He needs something. He needs maybe some guidance. At that point, where does he go in South Africa? And I'm saying that in this country, there's very little that guy can do to gear up for the next phase, from backyard to now being in a formal structure, employing people, good machinery. It's a different thing. And that transition from a hustler, a side hustle, doing a few things, into something that's more meaningful. Geez, we're struggling in this country.
I agree. I do think, though, in the small business sector, if somebody has got something and it needs to change gears, somebody is going to provide the lubrication for that. I think that this is an overblown issue. The real issue as a businessman is a very, very simple one.
Okay.
Right? And that is, this has got to be the most impossible place to try and do business. Right? You are constantly up against big corporates that behave like we're in Switzerland, and a government that behaves like we're in communist Russia. Right? So, it becomes almost impossible to start a business when we get that sorted out.
Yes.
There's also another thing that is transitory. It's a snapshot in time, and we've got, and I've got proof here of what I talk about, and that is that our best talent, let's face it, in South Africa, we have got, relative to the size of the community, white entrepreneurs are out there doing well, doing badly, but they're well represented. Right? Largely because they lost their corporate and government jobs.
Yep.
Right? The people that replaced them are the budding entrepreneurs, but they've stuck working in the Department of Home Affairs or basic education, etc. What happened in this country in the early 90s when our Afrikaner, who dominated the public sector back in the nationalist days, got kicked out of government, is all went and started businesses, and all of them are considerably richer than what they were when they worked for government. So hopefully, as our economy contracts, one of the positives will be really intelligent black people will lose their jobs, their government jobs, and they'll start legitimate businesses when they finish with the tender route, which is just, wow, it's got to be wonderful being a tenderpreneur. Really, you're going to provide the service to the government. It's going to cost R1 billion. Instead, my mate gives the job to me for R2 billion. I contract you for R1 billion, and I walk away with $1 billion for doing absolutely nothing. It's the best business in the world. Guys, if you want to start the best business, be a tenderpreneur. It's the best thing ever. We see the report come out with the PPE scandal. We know that nobody's ever going to get prosecuted. Don't waste your time doing business. Just become a tenderpreneur. It's your tip for the day. But let's just go back to reality here for the majority of people. The country is on the precipice of a disaster, financial disaster. And that is that we had a small mini commodities boom, which gave the fiscus a lot of money over the last 18 months.
Yeah.
Plus they went cap in hand to the World Bank and got money. So the government has actually had cash for the last 2 years. In the meantime, every company has fired people, people have gone bankrupt, liquidations are through the roof, etc. What is the next step? Because quite clearly, the tax take is going to be way down when the numbers start becoming, when they stop lying about the numbers. The tax take is going to be way down, and the World Bank is now giving us millions of dollars, not billions.
Yeah, so the employment situation is probably, to me, the most critical problem in South Africa. If you said to me, what is South Africa's number one economic crisis? It's the level of unemployment at every level. It's not just youth unemployment. If you go up an age group to the next age group beyond youth, that unemployment rate is now around the 50% mark. So unemployment in South Africa is a major issue. And there's no doubt that in the last 2 years, we've lost another, whatever it is, 1.5 million jobs. And we were not in a great employment environment to start with. And we know that every year, 600,000 more or less people enter the labor force. So to stop the unemployment rate going up, we need to create 600,000 jobs a year, every year. And we know we're near that because right now we're losing jobs, right? And so we're obviously just adding to the social dynamic in South Africa, social payments under pressure. Government will have to probably extend the 350 payment, and already a huge number of people are getting social grants, right? And that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable at a fiscal level because ultimately you're not going to get the tax revenue to afford all of this. If you just continue on with 1 or 2% economic growth, how many jobs does, let's say 2% economic growth, how many jobs does that create? At best, maybe 100,000 jobs, 200,000 jobs if you're really lucky. We need 600,000 to stop the unemployment rate going up. So what happens to the other people? Tend to go into the social dynamic of this country, and government has to then try and fund it in various ways. And so your tax revenue will ultimately be under pressure and you can't fund it, and government's debt has already ramped up and that will continue to escalate. So the path that we're on at the moment is just not a sustainable path, right? Where we perhaps got a bit lucky, as you say, is the commodity boom, because it came at the right time in that we got this revenue windfall from the mining sector that was hugely beneficial. But what are we doing with it? If you look at that revenue windfall, we've used a lot of it to extend the social payments or to help state-owned enterprises, etc. We haven't taken that money and put it into infrastructure and job creation. So again, not sustainable. So the message is coming home, I think, ultimately, that without higher economic growth, the tax base will not rise because employment will not rise, and that you're going to have to do a much bigger restructuring of how government functions. Now, government would obviously resist that because that's a lot of their voter base and a lot of their support base, but that's where the country's heading. And we don't have many years before we're going to end up in an outright crisis. So the only way out of this is real economic growth, where you take that 2% and you're now 4%, 6%. But in order to get that, you need fixed investment. That fixed investment can't come from government because government doesn't have the finances to fund fixed investment, to fund infrastructure. It has to come from the private sector. They're the only people with a balance sheet. South African corporates are the only people in this country with a balance sheet who could potentially fund a growth dynamic in this country. So we're on borrowed time right now, and if we just do nothing, this is going to end very badly in terms of a fiscal crisis. So you're 100% right. What you keep hoping is that government wakes up to this. And that was the hope when Cyril was elected. And that was the hope when Tito was Minister of Finance and Enoch Minister of Finance, that that message starts to resonate fully in government, that you can't continue on this path and that you have to turn to the private sector to do much more fixed investment. And if the start of that is private-public partnerships, so what? Go that route. Get the private sector involved because it's not sustainable. Unfortunately, the politics doesn't want to capitulate to that thought. And right now, internally within the ANC and within government, you can see the fight within themselves as to which route do we go. Do we go the reformist route, draw the private sector in and try and grow this economy? Or do we go the populist route where we talk about land expropriation and about social payments and a social benefit that extends to everybody, etc.? We haven't resolved that at a political level. And you can see the government fighting that. And as long as they're fighting that, this country is going to continue to struggle because we're not implementing the changes you need fully to take this country forward.
And the people that we sort of hoped would be champions of the reformists have been unbelievably disappointing. I mean, obviously Cyril Ramaphosa is more of a socialist than Jacob Zuma ever was. You know, I always say to people that Jacob Zuma wasn't that bad for business because at least he understood that if you're stealing money, you need the money to generate. You know, no mafia boss took all the money from the people they were shaking down. Otherwise, you can't shake them down in the future. So at least Jacob Zuma knew that the economy had to keep going. You know, I was always very, very afraid of Cyril Ramaphosa's credentials, because to just be a shareholder who just gets rich by holding paper and sitting in the corner and collecting a dividend. I mean, the poor guy was given one job to do ever in his positions, and that was to quell the riots at Marikana, and all he managed to do was get the miners killed. So, you know, he doesn't have a great track record in business. You know, he didn't exactly invent McDonald's. And Tito Mboweni was famous for his ugly shoes because he kept on kicking the can down the road. So he was hardly the reformist we need. Enoch Ganagwana, right? Does the guy exist? We saw him give a half-baked midterm budget speech. Since then, is he being held captive, or do you know if he's around? Or
So I think he's had some health issues. I think he's been in hospital. But so he wrote the document, the current policy document, the ANC Reconstruction and Recovery Program. And it comes back to this, what I said right at the beginning, is that when you listen to Cyril's speeches, when you listen to Tito when he was in Minister of Finance, Enoch, the speeches, the intention, the pronouncements, if you go back to the last budget speech that Tito did, or even the medium-term budget that Enoch did, those pronouncements, there's nothing wrong with them. That's the intention. And obviously, if you could implement that intention, then South Africa would move forward. It comes down to those end up being words. Now, when Cyril first entered into the role as president, those speeches that he made, that was what got people excited in this country, because it felt like he was going to be the reformist, that he was going to deregulate, make it easier to do business. He was going to involve the private sector. He understood the role of foreign investment. He understood the importance of fixed investment and employment, and he had those, remember the investment conferences once a year where Alibaba came out to South Africa, and there was a lot of hype about that, right? So buying into that, there was nothing wrong with that, because that's what the country needs. Unfortunately now, over a longer period of time, incredibly little delivery. And you can make an argument that in the office of the presidency, there are people who are trying to deregulate industry, and Dr. Ramaphosa within the infrastructure team is trying to move infrastructure forward. So there are those initiatives. They're just incredibly slow. And so you can't point to anything, and that's the problem. I'm going to be doing an economic presentation in the next day or two, and I'm trying to look at South Africa and say, where's the growth stimulus going to come from? What can I tell my audience to watch for as the growth dynamic of this country? And that page has got nothing on it at the moment, because what I've got is a whole lot of speeches, a whole lot of promises, a whole lot of, yes, we are going to do this. But what has actually happened? I've got very little, right? And when we try and fill up that page, we keep going back to the energy sector. And that's what we've got. And the energy sector was born out of a crisis. So it feels to me that South Africa, with a lot of these things, has to get to that point of crisis where you've literally run out of energy, where you've got a social protest, looting, that you now get involved in, you feel that you need to do something. And that's the terrible way to run this country. You're looking for the next crisis to spark the reforms. So we know what we need to do. The government knows what they need to do because they articulate it all the time. The difficulty is getting it done. The sad thing is, I don't think it would take a lot. I think if you could implement some of these reforms, show that they're actually being done, brag about them legitimately when they are being done, you would build up a lot of credibility very quickly around the implementation of reform. So let me give you an example. Pier 2 Harbour. Government has said that we need to upgrade Durban Harbour, Pier 2. Why Pier 2? Because it's the biggest container port In South Africa, and the biggest container port, I don't know, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's substantial, right? And there's no doubt we've got to revamp it and upgrade it. And there's no doubt that Transnet and government doesn't have the money to do that. So they come up with the right idea, and that is involve the private sector in Pier 2. Now, that thing just goes quiet. We don't hear. What we need to hear is this private sector is involved in Pier 2. This is the initiative. This is the project. This is when it would be completed. That would instill some confidence. We're just not doing that. And so I think the intentions are there. I think Cyril has got the right ideas, and the teams that he speaks to, I think they come up with some decent ideas. Implementation. It all comes down to implementation. And unfortunately, you've gone so far past the first speech that you've lost credibility without implementation. There's only so many times you can say, we're going to be doing this, we're implementing this, this will happen. And it doesn't happen, that people lose faith in that implementation. And so we've seen that in the business community, where the business community is saying, geez, this is another speech. I just don't believe it. Now we're in a situation where seeing is believing. And without that, I think this country is going to struggle to move forward.
And obviously, we've now had the experience of the pandemic, which, you know, we must never forget that we got awarded junk status before the pandemic, you know, because
deep junk status, actually, when you look at it.
And we must resist when politicians tell us it's because of the pandemic. We were there before the pandemic, and it's obviously been made worse. And on top of that, the level of cynicism has now bubbled over. You said this could result in sort of some sort of social strife. Well, we already had the social strife, and so obviously a fairly bleak picture. To the people watching us today, Kevin, what do you do? Do you just short the rand at every move? Do you just try and get your money offshore as hard and as possible? Is that the only option left to South Africans?
So that is an obvious part of what you would have if you're going to have assets in this country, some sort of portfolio, whatever those assets are. You've got to have a sizable portion of your assets offshore, not just because South Africa's up against it, that South Africa's struggling, because South Africa is 0.5% of the world economy, right? 0.5%, it's not quite 0.5%, I rounded up just so I feel better. So 0.5% of the world economy, and you've got all of your money in 0.5% of the world economy. It's not sensible. What about the other 99.5% out there? Aren't there investment opportunities? And the answer is yes, there's overwhelming investment opportunities. So it makes logical sense to have a diversified portfolio, whatever that portfolio is, whether it's equities, whether it's property, whatever it is. If you're in a position where you've got some assets and you have an ability to move some of that offshore, I would certainly do that to the extent that I can. You just don't want to have everything here. Now, having said that, not that long ago, the South African stock market was at an all-time record high, right? And we have this dichotomy within South Africa where the economics seem dreadful, the unemployment seems dreadful, the inequality seems dreadful, the looting, all of that is dreadful, yet the stock market did quite well. And the reason is that the stock market is represented by companies that have turned out to be fairly resilient. They work in fairly concentrated industries. They don't have a huge amount of competition. They've got an ability to have pricing. They can keep their margins up. They've cut costs through cutting employment. And so there's a resilience within South African companies, and so you're investing in some of that, and some of those companies have offshore earnings, and that's decent. So I'm not in a position where I would say, no, don't invest in South Africa. I think there are opportunities. And the other thing is that you want to be awake to the idea that just maybe something starts to come right, something starts to get implemented, because the turnaround would happen quite quick. It's off a low base. And I wouldn't completely discount that. So my view is that you have to have significant assets offshore, but because you live and work in South Africa, you understand this. There are investment opportunities, and don't close yourself off to that. If I look at South Africa's stock market last year, it was up 24%. 24% is a decent return for anybody. And it was a broad-based increase. It wasn't just one stock that went up. So I'm saying there are returns to be had in South Africa. I wouldn't move everything offshore, but you've got to also be realistic about this. The longer it takes for South Africa to implement the necessary reforms, it means that the pressure pot is building in South Africa, and that pressure pot is social. It spilled over in the looting in July last year. Remember, every year, 600,000 people, that we talk about the metric results, and all of these people who've got aspirations for the future, 600,000 people enter our labor market. How many of them will find gainful employment? And the more we don't absorb those individuals, what's happening to society underneath it? The social fabric is decaying and the pressure pot is boiling. And at some point it will spill over, as in the looting. So my view is, be sensible for what's out there. Don't run offshore. Don't take everything offshore. Have a decent amount offshore. There could be opportunities here, but you're looking for the catalyst that unlocks South Africa, and we don't see it yet.
You don't see a trigger for the government taking the right actions?
Government has said they're going to do it. And if I look at the speeches, it's hard for me to be critical of those speeches. If I look at the new Minister of Finance, I've had meetings with him. The intention is good. I would not criticize the intention. It's sensible and it's realistic within the South African context, and it balances the need for a social imperative in this country and to deal with the social dynamics and the inequality of the past, together with a way to move this country forward. So I would say that those policy intentions are good. What I'm looking for, what I'm desperately looking for, is a sign that implementation is happening. And that's damn difficult to do. Now, initially the discussion was, okay, we've got a lot of institutional decay, that the Zuma era's carved out a lot of our institutional capability, and we've ended up with a weak set of institutions, and we saw that in the MPA, the prosecuting authority. And I buy that. I think there was that institutional decay. But it's been a significant time period since then, and we need to see an idea that these reforms are being implemented and that these institutions are being rebuilt. We're not seeing that enough. And the way we can see it is an actual prosecution. People are going to jail, or an actual project that has been implemented. We're just not seeing enough of that. And my message to government would be, just do something. Give people that hope that this thing is going to change, that what you're saying will be implemented. And when you implement it, tell people about it and try and instill confidence on the back of that. Small steps, build it up. I've got nothing right now. I've got a lot of promises on paper, but I've got nothing to say it's moving forward.
Well, as more than one commentator has said, we can either have a modern economy or an ANC government. We can't have both. We've got 27 years of proof of that. Elections are not that far away. We've taken so much pain. It's been 15 years of pain. We're 18 months away from an election, more or less. We're probably going to see some political changes. It has to happen because this is just, the government has done nothing. So fussbait, I think, is the South African term for what people out there need to do. To everybody that's joined us today, it's going to be a bumpy ride. 2022 doesn't offer much better than 2021, other than, I think the one thing we can look forward to in 2022 is, in the market terms, we call it a dead cat bounce. That is, if you throw a cat out of the building from high enough, the thing will bounce, right? That the economy will get some small recovery just as life comes back following the pandemic house arrests. So let's hope that bounces enough to sustain us, to get us to those elections in 2024. Kevin Lings, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been interesting. We're going to get you back at the State of the Nation. Thank you to everybody that joined us. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to do a lot more work on the economy because it's becoming very, very important as to where South Africa goes to. So from the State of the Nation today, it's Michael Sham thanking you all for joining us. To Kevin, thank you for your contributions. We'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Mike.